Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this presentation, this history-minded presentation. I'd especially like to welcome you on behalf of Phi Alpha Theta. Phi Alpha Theta, for those of you who do not know, is a National History Society, honor society. I myself am the president of the DSU chapter, which is the Alpha Lambda Pi chapter of Phi Alpha Theta here at DSU. And we have our other officers of the club in attendance tonight. Phi Alpha Theta, as I said, is a National History Honor Society. Members must have 12 hours in history, a GPA of 3.1 in history courses, and a 3.1 overall GPA to be members. Professors who have taught a history course can also qualify to be members of the Phi Alpha Theta Honor Society. As the president of the Alpha Lambda Pi chapter of Phi Alpha Theta, I would like to introduce the person introducing our speaker tonight. The introducer is Dr. William Hansard. He is the outreach coordinator and digital media specialist for the Theodore Roosevelt Center, housed here on Dickinson State's campus. For those of you who do not know, the Theodore Roosevelt Center is the digitizing center of Theodore Roosevelt's paper items. Theodore Roosevelt was renowned for reading and writing probably every day. And so Dr. Hansard is part of the immense effort in digitizing all of those paper goods, making them accessible for everyone across the country and across the globe. He has a Ph.D. in transatlantic history from the University of Texas at Arlington. He is a scholar of Gilded Age and the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, archives and public history. He is here to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. William Hansard.
Thank you for that introduction, Maddie. I do appreciate that. And you also made some of the points I was going to make in advance of me, which is fantastic. It means I don't have to talk as long. So as Maddie told you, I'm one of the staff members at our Theodore Roosevelt Center here at Dickinson State University. And this is a project we are immensely proud of, taking this monumental task of reuniting and annotating Roosevelt's scattered papers under this single umbrella, our digital library at theodorerooseveltcenter.org. And we've got everything from letters, the papers that she talked about, to photographs, to film footage, to audio recordings, you name it, we probably have some version of it. And just a couple of numbers to really drive that point home. Currently, almost 90,000 records comprised of more than 200,000 individual pages of materials are available on this digital library, accessible to anyone, anywhere in the world with an internet connection 24/7. We've also tracked down information for more than 25,000 individuals for our known persons database. This helps us determine copyright and to provide some further context to these records. Our staff members, including myself, who work with these records daily, are also available to anyone for research assistance, just not 24/7 like the website is. But shoot us an email, give us a phone call, send us a message on social media even. We'll do our best to help you answer those burning questions about TR and the world in which he lived. And finally, for daily TR content curated by yours truly, you can follow us on our Facebook, Instagram, or X pages. Search for Theodore Roosevelt Center and you will find us. Now I've gotten a little plug out of the way, it is my honor to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Dr. Henry J. Jerry Hendrix, Ph.D., is a retired Navy captain, having served 26 years on active duty following his commissioning through the Navy ROTC program at Purdue University. During his career, Hendrix served in a variety of maritime patrol aviation squadrons, as well as on supercarriers and light amphibious assault ships. His shore duty assignments were as a strategist on the staffs of the Chief of Naval Operations, the Secretary of the Navy, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and within the Office of Net Assessment. Through these tours, Dr. Hendrix established a reputation for using history to illuminate current strategic challenges. Following his retirement from the Navy, following a standout tour as the director of the Navy History and Heritage Command, he has worked as a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security and as a vice president at a Washington, D.C. defense consultancy. Dr. Hendrix holds a bachelor's degree from Purdue University in political science, a master's in national security affairs from the Naval Postgraduate School, a master's in history from Harvard University, and a Ph.D. in war studies from King's College London. He's the author of 2 books, Theodore Roosevelt's Naval Diplomacy and To Provide and Maintain a Navy. Dr. Hendrix is currently a senior fellow at the Sagamore Institute, an Indianapolis-based think tank, where he continues to approach the nation's defense challenges with the solid, pragmatic outlook of a native Hoosier farmer, which he's always been and always will be. And with that, I turn it over to Dr. Hendrix. Thank you.
Thank you, and we have a good sound level. Yep, sounds like we got a good sound level. First of all, I want to issue some thanks. First of all, to Chancellor Hagerott, Mr. Gorenflo, his chief of staff, Dr. Easton. Thank you for coming this evening, Dr. Wells. Thank you for showing me around today, as well as what you're doing here at the university. So it's a pleasure here. To do this particular presentation in front of 2 Navy captains who are not slouches in terms of naval history or their appreciation of the language is a bit intimidating. And then I will tell you that Mr. Gorenflo is also a Rhodes Scholar in English literature, so he is the most meticulous proofreader I have ever dealt with in my career. And I dealt with him for about 2 years solid during one of those tours inside the Pentagon. So I hope everything is punctuated correctly. I found a missing comma last night, and I got that one correct before we went in here. Just before we start into this, I want to just point out, this is the cover of my book when it came out over a decade ago. The photograph itself was in a private collection, and I found it online at a website. And it goes to the importance of actually collecting these things and bringing them together in a place that they can be promulgated and made available to scholars. I actually had to write this gentleman. He graciously signed off, giving me permission to use this as long as I acknowledged him in the jacket, and I did. But I found this interesting because this is Theodore Roosevelt welcoming the Great White Fleet home. So something he was able to do just prior to leaving office in 1909, in March of 1909. So I found this interesting because I think it really bespeaks the great affinity that he had with the United States Navy. So tonight's presentation is going to talk about a couple of different topics. One, we're going to tell the story about what I discovered when I was doing my research about Roosevelt's relationship with the Navy. But because there's also history students here, I'm going to have a discussion about historical research methodology, because there's an ongoing debate within the profession. And I want to raise that with you here and talk about how I approach this and where I got the insight to approach this. But we're going to talk about Roosevelt and historical schools, the bifurcation of statecraft studies, him as a master statesman, the idea of Theodore Roosevelt in the round, considering him as the whole man. And then also the understandings that I have dealing with the Venezuela crisis, Panama's revolution, the Moroccan crisis, Perdicaris alive or Razuli dead. And then finally, the Portsmouth Peace Treaty of 1905 and some of the unique things that came out of that. But I think it's kind of interesting on how this arose and where I started the research, because obviously I'm a naval officer. It's not like they just encourage us to go off to school. And in fact, it's kind of viewed as a negative in your career if you have too much of an affinity for graduate education. So I had to kind of pick my way through my career, and I managed to survive and make 06 only through the grace of God. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the components of Rooseveltian thought and the way that it's treated within the literature. So in my mind, as I was going through and doing historical reviews, there was 2 views of Roosevelt. One as Roosevelt as a diplomat, and the other one as Roosevelt as a navalist. And these were treated somewhat separately and distinct in the literature. And in fact, I found it interesting that if you do a review of a lot of the secondary sources, there's much more coverage of Roosevelt as a diplomatist. and then as Roosevelt as a navalist. Although I think that the Roosevelt as a navalist literature is deeper and stronger in many ways than some of the books over here. There's also different eras that go on. You know, there's the Wilsonian era revisionist. We got into the realist of the Morrison era when Elton E. Morrison really was bringing out the letters. And then Beale's treatment of that. Then we have the period of anti-imperialism in the 1960s when there was nothing good to say about Theodore Roosevelt. And then we get into the McAuliffe and Morris era where we sort of re-examine him as a broader, great figure of history in a very positive way. Roosevelt as a navalist starts, first with the rise of American naval power with the Sprouts, the husband and wife team, Julius Pratt with his large policy, West, O'Gara, Seeger, etc. But these are sort of, again, looking at Roosevelt as a navalist, his relationship with the United States Navy, which was deep, abiding, and intimate. Roosevelt was deeply involved in the Navy. How involved, I'm going to get into with you, and I think it's going to shock you to a certain degree at the level of how much his hand, there was no hidden hand with Theodore Roosevelt in the Navy. That hand was open and being displayed every day. So we'll get into these different things. I want to say this because in many ways, the professional literature treated this as stovepipes. We considered these things either here or there, and for that matter, there's other aspects of Roosevelt, such as Roosevelt as a progressive and so on, that are treated sort of simply and individually. Roosevelt is far, far too complex of a character. You cannot consider Roosevelt in any stovepipe. You have to consider Roosevelt as a deep, all of these aspects deeply intertwined. Roosevelt in the round. And in fact, when I started to do my studies of him, Dr. John Allen Gable, then the director of the Theodore Roosevelt Association and one of the leading scholars on TR, he had done his doctoral dissertation on Roosevelt as a progressive, really encouraged me, tilt TR around, examine him from all aspects. It is only then you'll really gain an appreciation of the brilliance of this man, this once in a generation intellect, the ability to recall entire books from memory simply by closing his eyes, and his hand would go up and he would begin reading the lines out loud, by the way, in 7 different languages, including ancient Norwegian, which is something that he had a real fascination with, was the Vikings, the writings, the poetry of the Vikings. And so dealing with Roosevelt and trying to get your mind around him. Also, I don't know, someone, I believe that you said that you think he wrote every day. I don't know of a day that he didn't. And also reading every day, a book a day, Roosevelt, a book a day, and also being extremely damaging to books because he would read a page and tear it out and throw it around the floor. His wife was appalled because she would come into his office and there are pages laying all over the place, but it was a bad habit he got into that terrifies me. But this is where I'm going to get into methodology. Again, a lot of people tend to look at this in a macro level. I'm going to look at the big picture. A lot of the diplomatic historical literature deals with the idea of the traditional paradigm of looking at things in the big picture. So a lot of diplomatic history tend to look at TR in this very big, very broad scope. And I'll get into a specific instance of this, and this is where my research begins. I, on the other hand, inverted the paradigm and began to look deep in the micro of the literature in the archives, looking at individual letters and logbooks. Now, why did this happen? It happened because I was doing a study of the Venezuelan crisis, and I went to talk with a Ph.D. historian who was also a reserve Navy captain. His name is Dave Rosenberg. You both know him. And Rosenberg was working in a staff called Deep Blue, and under a guy named Jim Stavridis, another PhD, Tufts, Fletcher. And I was talking about this challenge of this piece of paper I'd found that dealt with a British war plan. And it was a war plan for dealing with the United States. And this war plan was written in 1902. And there was a war plan to deal with the United States. How do you do an invasion of New York? The Brits, okay? And I talked to Rosenberg about this document I'd come across in the British archives in Kew Gardens. And Dave says, well, do you think that would work? And I said, well, there's difficulty with, this and that and, getting ground lodgement ashore. And he goes, no. He says, Jerry, stop thinking like a historian. Think about it like a naval officer. Step back in. You've accumulated all this knowledge of being at sea and on Navy ships and in airplanes. Would that work? And I'm like, no, it won't work. We've got interior lines. We own our own home waters. I can get a preponderance of force with the Navy there. I can cut off their sea lines of communication. He goes, yes. So stop thinking like a historian and think like a Navy guy. It's like, oh. So I started diving into some of these basic questions that I was looking at, like the Venezuela crisis. And the issue with the Venezuela crisis, well, let's just skip ahead to that. The issue with the Venezuela crisis was, well, hold on, let me do this and then we'll get to Venezuela. All right. So this is kind of what I found. All right. First of all, Roosevelt is one of the leading strategists of his day. Okay. And I'm going to say that again. Roosevelt was one of the leading strategists of his day. We think about Alfred Thayer Mahan. We think about some of the other, Corbett and so on. Roosevelt not only had the mind and the reading and the research, but he also was a political operator, and he was actually able to make his thoughts manifest in public policy and strategy. So if you look around the world in the 20th century, who are the two leading strategists of the 20th century? Their names immediately leap out to you: Theodore Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. Both men who had served in public office, both had been scholars, both made their livings as writers and had to put pen to paper to establish their ideas, debate it in the public forum, and so on. So Roosevelt, one of the great leading strategists, he wrote this Naval War of 1812 when he was, 20? Well, he did it in his senior thesis at college. He publishes it just a couple of years later. He gets it out there. So let's just say by age 24, Theodore Roosevelt has established a book which is still a common reference now over 140 years later. I mean, who does that at 24? Just doesn't happen. And yet the research is still, and by the way, this book caused me no small amount of problems with the university faculty at King's College at the University of London, who all hate this book because it portrays the British Navy in a light that they don't like. But I said, well, what fact do you disagree with? And that's where the conversation just goes sideways. And we had to make an agreement to disagree, or else I wouldn't have gotten my doctoral hood. He became a technical expert on naval technology. So Roosevelt, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, would make a point of going on board ships and crawling down in the engine spaces and firing off guns and learning about the mechanisms and learning about, gyros and electricity on board ship. It was a time of fundamental technical scientific change in the U.S. Navy, and Roosevelt was up to his hips in it. And I can say that because Edith Roosevelt was constantly complaining about Roosevelt destroying his clothing by going on Navy ships. He was a new interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine had been in place since the time of John Quincy Adams as our Secretary of State. But Roosevelt is the first person who makes the Monroe Doctrine manifest. He actually imposes it on the Western Hemisphere and ejects European colonial powers from the hemisphere and said, no, we have primacy here. And then also the concept of preparedness, the idea that the United States needed to be prepared on the world stage for combat. Get ready for a war that's coming. And if you are prepared enough, the war will not come. So this idea of peace through strength, which is generally ascribed today to Reagan, actually goes to a Roman maxim that Roosevelt actually gave a lecture on as Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the Naval War College about the importance of being prepared for war. If you're prepared for war, if you desire peace, prepare for war. All right. So we're going to do the Venezuela crisis finally. My favorite thing. I mean, really my favorite thing. Because there was I remember Edmund Morris gave a lecture at the Naval War College, and he wrote an essay that appeared in the Naval War College Review shortly after that, where he talked about the fact that Roosevelt later in like 1918 time period, just a few years before his death, talked about the fact that way back in 01, 02, he had issued this démarche to the British and I believe the Italians and the Germans, because they were establishing a blockade of some of the ports in Venezuela. And Morris talked about this because Roosevelt had written about this, and yet no one had been able to find any evidence in the diplomatic record about this event. But Morris went on because he makes the observation, which I thought was really revealing. He says, but the interesting thing is that not only is there no notice of this event in the diplomatic record covering the days in which Theodore Roosevelt said that this happened, but in fact, there is no event in the diplomatic record. It's as if the pages of history had been removed deliberately from the diplomatic record, as if there had been a cover-up. Something needed to be hidden. And Roosevelt said he had done this privately to tell the Brits and the Germans and the Italians to go home, or else he was going to send the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, the combined Atlantic Fleet, down into the Caribbean to eject them from the region, because Roosevelt was going to implement the Monroe Doctrine. So I found that interesting. And so he was correct. There's nothing in the diplomatic record, but I decided to go to the National Archives and I began to pull the logbooks of all of the ships that were in the Atlantic Fleet at that time. And I found that they had all assembled, some 54 ships, had all assembled off of Puerto Rico, and for an annual winter exercise. Now, this isn't uncommon. There was an annual winter exercise every year at this time period. But what was interesting was some of the things that happened down there. First of all, Roosevelt sends Admiral of the Navy, George Dewey, to be the commander-in-chief of the exercise. Now, Dewey is the equivalent of a 6-star admiral today. No one has ever held that rank since then. He is senior even to the fleet admirals, the 5-star fleet admirals of World War II. So Dewey is the senior officer in naval history. And he had been the hero of the Battle of Manila Bay. And so to send Dewey down was a real signal to everyone involved, because George Dewey was known as a hothead inside Navy circles. He was also known as someone who was thinking about running for president. So this was giving him a platform to go and do this. Then Roosevelt sends Dewey and gives him the USS Mayflower, the presidential yacht of the United States, as his flagship, because it's got all these radios and communications devices. So not only is Roosevelt sending Dewey, he's sending his yacht. Okay, that's a clear indication of the prestige that Roosevelt is attaching to whatever comes next. Next thing is the exercise had been pre-planned for months about what the Navy was going to test. There was going to be amphibious assaults, there was going to be gunfire, there was going to be different exercises, there was going to be shore leave in the Caribbean for American sailors. That's really important, shore leave. And what happens when they get down there is that everything changes. First of all, none of the ships are allowed to go to cold iron. All right, that's where we shut down the plants, the steam plants, and bring the ship in and rest it and do some cleaning and some maintenance of it. All ships are required to maintain steam at this. Another thing, they establish a 50-bed hospital ashore in Puerto Rico. All right, there is no reason for a 50-bed trauma hospital. All the doctors of the ships are taken off from the ships and put into the trauma hospital, standing by for some major event. And then, in the most telling thing for me as an operator, all of the ambulatory sick of the fleet. Normally, if you get sick, you're sent ashore to kind of, take the pressure off of whatever's left on board the ship. All of the ambulatory crewmen are recalled to fully man the ships. Then Dewey writes a letter, which I found in Dewey's spidery cursive handwriting that almost no one can read today, where he's writing to his son, and he's talking about things are looking rather difficult down Venezuela way. I think that we will be in it within 48 hours. And so by going into the logbooks, first of all, I recognized all the ships are maintained on combat setting, that they are fully fueled, that they are fully armed. Whatever firing, as soon as a gunfire occurs, the armament and the ordnance is replaced on board the ship, often reserves from Puerto Rico. And all of the amphibious landings that the Marines were going to do are canceled. They are all kept on board the ship. So it's very clear that for the 10 days that Roosevelt describes in his later 1918 record, that this is really, we are on the edge of war. So that emerges out of these primary sources of Navy logbooks. Changing inspection, full fuel, establishing the trauma hospital, message traffic flying back and forth, encrypted message traffic at a time when encryption was very difficult to do. And Roosevelt is keeping track of everything in DC. And we know that because Roosevelt's brother-in-law, a man named Captain Cowles, was married to his sister, Bammy. Cowles is Roosevelt's naval aide, and Cowles is sending telegrams from him, ostensibly from him, Cowles, but in reality from the president, directly to individual ship captains in the combined Atlantic fleet. So it's very clear from this that, in fact, what Edmund Morris said is a vast penumbra where the history is not really resolved and we really don't know what happened. We know exactly what happened. And we know the date that it begins, and we know the date that it ends based upon the readiness of the Atlantic fleet. We know when they are released to go into port and have their holiday port visits. So we know when it starts and when it finishes. Second case study that's covered within the book deals with Panama's revolution. Now, Panama is central to the Theodore Roosevelt story. From the time he begins writing and he begins his intellectual association with Alfred Thayer Mahan, the idea of creating a canal through the isthmus is part and parcel with everything that they write. This is important to be able to swing the American fleet between the East and the West Coast. Mind you, at this time, the American fleet is not large enough to have a fully fleshed out Pacific fleet and a fully fleshed out Atlantic fleet. We had one fleet, and we needed to be able to swing it. So Roosevelt begins to put pressure upon Colombia, who owned Panama at that time, to allow this. And Colombia essentially put a treaty through their parliament on two separate occasions. And in both times, they pulled the treaty from the floor because there were not enough bribes forthcoming from Americans to bribe enough of the senators in the Colombian legislature to pass the treaty. They were holding out. So TR, being TR, said, enough of this. I'm going to see if Panama wants to go its own way. There had been a number of revolutions, over 50 revolutions in Panama across the 19th century. Roosevelt knew that there was another revolution in the offing. And if there wasn't another revolution in the offing, he was going to give one a little kickstart. So he actually sends two American soldiers. The lead is a man named Chauncey B. Humphreys, and I've come across his letters, down there to essentially work with local Panamanian rebels to stir up the revolution. And then not only do we know exactly the day that the revolution is going to occur, but we know where it's going to start and under what circumstances. And all this has been relayed back to Roosevelt and, for that matter, the State Department and the Department of War and the Department of the Navy in Washington, D.C. So at the time that it starts, the only thing that was visible was that there was one ship that pulled into one port in Panama. And that was just there to show that we had an American interest. But what I determined by going into the logbooks was that we had ships backed up both on the Atlantic and Pacific coast, battleships. The Mayflower was there, Olympia was there, one of our cruisers. We also had two ships that were there carrying Marines. And what's even more interesting about the Marine Corps is that Roosevelt had personally ordered the Brigadier General Commandant of the Marine Corps, the top Marine in the Corps, to form a provisional brigade of Marines, embark on board two ships, and be prepared to storm and take Panama from both coasts. So Brigadier General Elliott, that gentleman up there, that is the last Marine Corps commandant to actually command Marines in the field in a potential combat situation, because he left Washington, D.C. down there and went down to Panama and stayed in Panama. They landed. When it was discovered that the one ship was not sufficient to coerce the Colombians to give up, another ship hove to over the horizon. And what no one understood was that Roosevelt had ships backed up over the horizon, and he was just going to gently increase the pressure by increasing naval presence and use them if they needed to be to storm or to shell Colombian positions ashore on both coasts. But in the end, there was a Panamanian Revolution. They did declare their independence. We did almost immediately recognize them as an independent country, and we almost immediately, within 60 days, got a treaty in place to allow the beginning of the digging of the Panama Canal across the isthmus, which we then controlled the Panamanian Canal Zone until the Carter administration, essentially administering it and running it as a geostrategic choke point, and which it remains a geostrategic choke point today, although it is limited in the size of ships that can pass through it. And currently it's also limited. I find this interesting. So this is new since my research. If many of you will note, if you go and Google Panama Canal today, that there's a big story about the Panama Canal is not able to take as much ship traffic today as when it once did. Many people state that this is because of climate change. Now, I believe the climate is changing. I can see that. You know, I've got a paleontologist in the family, and we've been watching climate change for 65.5 million years. That being point, the reason why Panama's canal is having difficulty today is that when we designed it based upon Army Corps of Engineers' knowledge of how much rainwater fell in central Panama. And so Panama's canal is completely controlled by freshwater being drained from lakes in the canal zone. And so when Panama, after it gained control, decided to expand the size of the locks within the canal, they ignored essentially the Army Corps and took best case information and said, well, this is how many ships will pass through. The simple fact is there's not enough quantity of fresh water to operate the canal at full capacity because they expanded the size of the canal zone. And so if we went back and look at the Army Corps lessons and the research that were done during the dig, that's why they made the locks the size that they did, was they knew how much water they could count on, the median of water that they could count on every year. When we expanded those canal zone locks and over the last 30 years, we got outside the limits of that engineering. Case study 3 deals with the Perdicaris affair. This is very famous. In fact, this picture right here is taken from a very famous movie where Perdicaris is in fact now not an old bearded old man, but in fact Candace Meredith. What's her name? The actress. Candace Bergen. Okay, so they converted Perdicaris from an old diplomat to a young, wealthy European woman or American woman to make it more interesting. And they did cast Sean Connery as Razuli, the brigand, and Brian Keith, a famous actor from when I was younger. You probably don't know him. You probably don't remember his last show, Hardcastle McCormick, which I did, had a great car. Anyways, Brian Keith played Theodore Roosevelt, and this is during the 1904 presidential campaign. And when Roosevelt, in front of his convention, says that I want Perdicaris alive or Razuli dead, very famous, very bellicose statement. However, there was an issue with this. I mean, we did land troops, we landed the Marines there, but we sent not one, not two, but 3 Navy squadrons over to try and bring diplomatic pressure, coercive naval pressure to bear upon the local government. But what they didn't understand was, in fact, that local government had no control over this brigand or terrorist that was living in the mountains of Morocco. And so no matter how much pressure we brought, all we were illuminating was the weakness of the local government. And in many ways, we set that local government up for eventual failure. Roosevelt, only because he's caught up in his own presidential campaign, and it's interesting looking at his letters at this point in time, because he sort of knee-jerk says, send a squadron. And when he doesn't get the result that he wants, he says, send another squadron. And so they send another squadron, and he still doesn't get the result that he wants. And it's only at that time that he sort of sets back and goes, this using the Navy to try to affect change has some limits. So he ends up sending the 3rd squadron, but then he lands troops. And he understands that he's not going to be able to use offshore influence, this idea of scalability of response. He's going to have to actually do it. He's going to have to go ashore, which is something he really didn't want to do at all. In fact, it's interesting, if you look across Roosevelt's presidency, 7.5 years, he has this reputation of being remarkably bellicose. But in fact, the man never goes to war. He's always trying to find that peaceful way out. And this is the time when he really gets stymied, and he has to come to focus about what what do we need to do here? So he did not seize the Moroccan customs house, which had been the European custom. He learns to step back and then work through the French, who had extensive contacts behind the scenes in Morocco, to bring pressure to bear. This causes problems between Roosevelt and the Germans because the Germans were trying to bring Morocco under their sphere of influence. But by us using the French, we were emphasizing French influence in the area. Anyways, long story short, this is a case study of the limits of naval power. The fact that naval power can only go up so far inland before it loses effectiveness. And you're really going to have to bring land power to bear. And that, in many cases, is quite frankly too high of a cost. Boots on the ground is a tremendously costly solution in military situations. And this is something I think, quite frankly, we kind of lost sight of over the years. The last case study I did for my doctoral dissertation, and it's included in the book, is actually a study of negotiating the Portsmouth Peace Treaty that ended the Russo-Japanese War. This is the only peace treaty that up until that time had ever been negotiated here on American soil. Roosevelt is largely credited for bringing this about, the end of the war, although Roosevelt himself never went to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Roosevelt conducted all of his negotiations from his home at Sagamore Hill. He did meet with them at Sagamore, and then he put them on his yacht, Mayflower. Mayflower is always showing up here, and sends them up to Portsmouth to do this. But Roosevelt does an interesting thing with the Navy here. I really found this fascinating. Roosevelt understood that in Europe, in the courts of Europe, there were court dress, there was uniforms that diplomats would wear, there were ceremonies that are used in European diplomacy and doing negotiations. It's a very measured, stylistic approach to diplomacy. We were a republic. We didn't have any of this court ceremony or court dress or these long-standing traditions. So Roosevelt makes the point of utilizing the United States Navy and Marine Corps and substitutes them. The ceremony of the Navy and Marine Corps, the firing of gun salutes, the use of Marines as honor guards. He uses that to create the sense of pageantry and pomp at the background. He also lodges them at the Portsmouth Navy Yard, which actually is not in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, but is in fact in Kittery, Maine, as any good Mainer will tell you, and every New Hampshire person will disagree with. So this is at Building 86 in Kittery, and they are ensconced here. We rent out a hotel called the Wentworth by the Sea, which is a palatial resort, 5-star resort that we put everybody up in. But they come here for the negotiations. And there is only one telegraph line that comes out of this building that allows these diplomats to negotiate with their home governments. And Roosevelt is listening in. So we are tapping the line, and Roosevelt is getting a daily report on how the negotiations are going as their diplomats themselves are communicating with their overseas embassies and with their embassies down in Washington and getting back to Japan and to Russia. So Roosevelt at a certain point in time understands that he needs to control security and access. He controls protocol. He monitors communications. And at the point where the negotiations are beginning to break down, he summons the diplomats to Sagamore. He recalls them to Sagamore. And he meets them in the most informal of ways. Roosevelt is actually in his white tennis flannels on his tennis court. And he meets with the diplomats individually on the side of the court and effectively tells them what's going to happen in the world if they fail to negotiate the end of the treaty. And understanding the starkness of what he had already communicated to the other capitals of Europe, they come back and they make their amends and they actually negotiate the end of this war. For this, Roosevelt becomes the first American to earn the Nobel Prize. It's the Nobel Peace Prize. It is interesting. He ends up having to go over and give his speech later in life because he can't go over to give his acceptance speech, when he receives it because he's still the president of the United States. But he earns this Nobel Prize. He gets the money that goes with it. He makes some donations to some individual organizations. In fact, the Roosevelt Association actually has some of this money in its beginning founding documents because there was still some money left over by that time. But it's interesting to me because this gets at the essence of TR, sort of, again, this bifurcation of him and understanding him in the round. Roosevelt is the first person, and near as I can tell, in some 2,200 years, to have earned both the highest award for peace along with the highest award for valor. Roosevelt having earned the Congressional Medal of Honor for his activities during the Spanish-American War and then earning the Peace Prize. You have to go back to Sulla during the Roman Republic time, actually it's the time of the Revolution, before you find a person who had both the grass crown, the highest award for valor, as well as the citizen's crown, essentially the olive for peace. And so you find this time of distance. And so Roosevelt being this person who can encapsulate these two aspects in one personality, I think is absolutely fascinating to me. All right. So again, I'm going to go over some of this. So I talked to you already about this idea of Roosevelt in charge. So this is Roosevelt's brother-in-law, Captain Cowles. He ends up going all the way to 2 stars. Cowles is Bammy's husband. Roosevelt loves him for the fact that he becomes the husband and a devoted husband to Roosevelt's favorite sibling. And Bammy, for those of you know, suffered a real crippling disease. And so she was very limited in what she could do physically, but she was extremely vivacious and had the largest personality in the family, and he adored her. So Roosevelt loved Cowles because Cowles loved Bammy. So Cowles is Roosevelt's aide for most of the time that Roosevelt is president of the United States. He only gives up being the naval aide to the president when, in fact, he gets promoted, which, of course, who's not going to promote the president's brother? But what's interesting is I have read Cowles's letters at the Houghton Library at Harvard, because many of the Roosevelt family papers are there. Are you guys going to get copies of the Houghton Library materials as well?
We have some, and hopefully we'll get more in the future.
All right. So it's amazing reading Cowles's letters, because for most of Cowles's life, he is rather pedantic and boring in his writing. And then he becomes the aide to the president of the United States, and suddenly his letters are amazing and vivacious and full of adjectives and verbs and adverbs. And it's absolutely incredible how descriptive he is. And then he gets promoted and he leaves the White House, and he is pedantic and boring again. His telegrams when he's the aide are amazing in their detail and the level of question and the granularity of what Cowles is interested in as the naval aide of the president. So what I'm hinting at, and what I think is very clear from reviewing the literature, is that Cowles is not sending anything. TR is using his brother-in-law to communicate directly with the fleet and the fleet commanders, the individual ship captains. So it's very clear TR is in charge. And how in charge is he? Well, in the time that TR is president, he has 2 secretaries of state. John Hay is the secretary who is in office when Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. John Hay was actually a friend of Theodore Roosevelt's father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., Greatheart, and John Hay, of course, had been secretary to Abraham Lincoln. And so TR was absolutely devoted to John Hay, but at the same time, he thought that John Hay was somewhat a little bit slow for how TR wanted to run the White House and the world. So at the appropriate time, Hay gets sick. In fact, he doesn't last that much longer. But when the time comes, TR gets Elihu Root to come in and become Secretary of State. And Root is a man after Roosevelt's own heart. In fact, there's a famous quote, and I'm going to get this wrong, but I'll try to get it as close as possible. When Roosevelt is talking about the Panamanian Revolution, he has Root, who is a very esteemed Wall Street lawyer, come in, and Roosevelt tells him the story about what he had done to bring about Panama's revolution. And Roosevelt says to Elihu, he says, "So, Mr. Root, how do you think I did?" And Root says, "Well, I think that you've conclusively proven that you were accused of theft and you're fundamentally guilty of rape." So Root knew how to keep up with Roosevelt. And so if you ever go to the National War College in D.C., Roosevelt Hall is right across the way from Root Hall. So it's sort of the center of intellectual thought. But anyways, these are the 2 secretaries of state that Roosevelt has over his 7.5 years as president of the United States. Now, as for the Secretary of the Navy, Roosevelt has 6 secretaries of the Navy across 7.5 years. They come in. Moody had been his boss, actually, when Roosevelt had been assistant secretary, and he's still there when Roosevelt accedes to the presidency after McKinley's dead. And then Roosevelt just starts moving through these guys. Each one of them serves, on average, only about 12 to 14 months as Secretary of the Navy. Moody gets bumped up to be an associate attorney general, and then he becomes an associate general or associate justice of the Supreme Court. Napoleon Bonaparte's great nephew is brought in. He's mostly famous for bringing John Paul Jones back and having him buried at the Naval Academy. Most of these people, if you go and look at their papers, there's no standout personality there. So when you have 6 secretaries of the Navy over a 7.5-year period, there is no Secretary of the Navy. It takes you at least 2 years to get up to speed on what the demands of the fleet and that office are about. So what do we know? TR is his own Secretary of the Navy. He's running the Navy on a day in, day out basis. He doesn't get involved with the Army. Quite frankly, I don't think that he's all that interested, other than the fact he gets rid of the deadwood by putting a physical fitness test in place that forces a bunch of 60-year-old fat guys to have to retire from active duty so that he can clear the deadwood and promote a bunch of younger men into the Army and, quite frankly, into the Marine Corps. So this 50-mile hike test that Roosevelt imposed upon the military, he did so only after demonstrating that he could do it himself. And then he made them all go out and do what he had done. So I find that, of course, he was the youngest president in the history of the United States and perhaps the best athlete. Gerald R. Ford is pretty good. George H.W. Bush pretty good. I think no one wants to go up against TR in a jiu-jitsu match or a boxing match, even when he was blinded. So some of the lessons learned, and I'm kind of bringing this around because I want to open it for questions as well. First of all, the lessons learned I took away from this was that Roosevelt is the first president probably since James Monroe, which is to say John Quincy Adams, who had been his Secretary of State, to have a very coherent American foreign policy. Roosevelt kind of knew where he wanted the United States to be at in the world, where it would exist upon the stage. He had a vision of where it was going. And this is one of the reasons why the 20th century becomes the American century, is because of the path that he sets us on. He pursued great power status. When he comes in, we are not a great power. We are ranked 7th in terms of naval power and in overall, tonnage and gunnery. We are in the top 3 when Roosevelt leaves office 7.5 years later. He begins building up the Navy, begins building up the battleships. He sends the Great White Fleet out and around the world. He creates an entire squadron of heavy cruisers. And I brought this up earlier today. Those heavy cruisers, which were to accompany the battleships, were called the Big Ten because they were named after internal states of the Union. Because Roosevelt began naming ships after plain states and Midwestern states because he wanted the entire country to feel invested in their Navy. So when you think about the Big Ten Conference, go Purdue, boil her up, that's where the term Big Ten comes from, is from Roosevelt's cruisers. That's the origination of that term. He wanted a big Navy. He wanted economic policy that was open door. He wanted diplomatic policy of the Monroe Doctrine enforced. The Western Hemisphere was the American hemisphere. If you're a European power, you are no longer welcome here, and you need to get the hell out. That was how TR looked at it. And he was bellicose in that way. But he was bellicose in the way that he applied power, that he shaped the sword, but he never drew the sword. And I think that's an important thing to understand. He wanted a strong American position based upon our own interests within a robust system, but where we had our strength based on our own hemisphere, recognizing our inherent strengths of being at the center of a global international trading system where all trade would come and go from Europe, from the great world island, whether it was Asia on one end of the Eurasian continent or Europe on the other end, but it would all flow through the United States. And if it wasn't going through the United States, it was going to go through the canal, and we would control that canal. So it's a very coherent foreign policy. He talked about American interests. Now, Roosevelt there's this ongoing tug of war between interests and values. It's often viewed as being between the two parties within the country. Wilsonian values-based foreign policy versus Republican interest-based foreign policy. This goes back to that point in time, TR versus, in many ways, Woodrow Wilson and the Wilsonian school. He pursued the nation's economic interests over its philosophical values. He was looking at opening markets for trade. This is very Mahanian. He's being informed by both Mahan and Henry Cabot Lodge, who was his best friend in all things. They were kind of a dynamic duo. You know, Lodge would control the legislature, and Roosevelt had the executive branch. He was predicated on export economy, where we would be manufacturing and industrializing, and we'd be sending our things overseas. And we needed to have guaranteed unimpeded access to sea lines of communication. This becomes the centerpiece of the American globalized system that we are still existing in today, but we're beginning to see break down and erode at the edges. And I'm going to get a little bit on that when we come around to the final slide. But supporting international institutions, Roosevelt was constantly saying, we need to take this to the International Tribunal at The Hague. Roosevelt is hinting at the League of Nations before it's the League of Nations. Now, Roosevelt could not support the League of Nations because it was a Wilsonian construct, and he hated that guy. Okay, but I think if Roosevelt looked at the growth of international institutions like NATO today, or for that matter, the United Nations, and he looked at them and what they were supposed to be, he would be in favor of that because of how he was constantly recommending that we send this difficulty between nations to the International Tribunal at The Hague for them to decide. You know, let's settle this peacefully. And it was only after those things broke down that he would intercede with military power. So these are some things to take away from TR as a leader. Roosevelt does this rise of coercive diplomacy. Now, there's a whole set of literature in both political science, international relations, and military history that deals with coercive diplomacy. Alexander George, I think, has written the definitive book on this back in the 60s and 70s. And I did a study of this just a few years ago. But this idea of naval power, not as a blunt instrument, but as the surest guarantee of peace. Roosevelt used the Navy not as a hammer, but as a scalpel. And he knew how to precisely apply power to bring about what he wanted as an outcome. The only time that he has difficulty is during the Moroccan crisis. And that's mostly because he's caught up in his election campaign. But when he's able to shake away from the convention enough to focus on this, he recognizes the imprecision. He was using the hammer when in fact he needed something that was much more precise than that, and he adjusted. He needed to declare the sphere of influence. Roosevelt, at this point in time, the United States was a backseat power. We were subordinate to the Europe. He declared that the Western Hemisphere was in fact our hemisphere, and then he enforced that. He enunciated again the clear foreign policy. He positioned our fleet for its greatest advantage. Roosevelt, because of the Panama Canal and his build up the American fleet, was actually coming out of his administration. We were able to begin creating both Atlantic and Pacific fleets. He also used the Great White Fleet to go around the world and really announce, that great line from the movie Bull Durham. You guys are probably too young, but when the pitcher comes up to his catcher and the guy says, I need you to throw the curveball. And he says, I don't want to throw the curve. I want to throw the fastball. And the pitcher says, well, I want to announce my position with authority. And the guy's like, okay. And then the hitter gets a home run. Roosevelt wanted to announce the United States position in the world with authority. And that's why he sent the Great White Fleet around, to show that we are here. We are loud. We are proud. We have modern technology. What is interesting, of course, is that the Connecticut class battleships were in fact antiquated by the time they deployed, because HMS Dreadnought had already hit the water, but Roosevelt was already building 7 dreadnoughts with gas turbine engines as opposed to reciprocal and larger board things. So that was the last hoorah for that older generation of battleships. But after that, we really had a really ultra modern fleet that emerged out of his building program that he put in place over the last 3 years of his administration. So scalability of response, talking about both the Venezuela and combined Atlantic fleet, how he would apply power. Panama tells us about the ship stack. Roosevelt was only going to show as much military power as he needed, and we'd hold everything back in reserve. He never wanted to flood the zone, as it were, with power unless he absolutely had to. So this scalability of response and the shifting squadrons of the Perdicaris affair, send 1, send 2, finally send 3, that's kind of important because he comes to understand the situation there. Today, So I wanted to show you this. So this is the combined Atlantic fleet that was actually sent down in Venezuela and the Caribbean. So as you can see, we stacked up everything that we had in the fleet at that point in time. This is movements of naval vessels. Again, this is Panama. So we've got the stack in the Caribbean, stack in the Pacific, battleships, cruisers, auxiliary ships, where they arrived, Panama City versus Cologne, the dates that they arrived. So you can see it stacking in during the Panamanian Revolution. Again, scalability response. And so this is, again, that chart showing them as they're stacked there. This is the European theater. So these are the 3 squadrons that he commenced and sent over, who commanded them, what their ships were, battleships, cruisers. And then finally, my point here is that it is the scalability response that leads us to the modern carrier strike group or expeditionary strike groups that we operate today. We no longer operate in sort of full fleet formations, but in fact, we go with smaller strike assets that are tailored to the environment in which they're going to deploy. Now, we do deploy large multi-carrier fleets. When I went to Desert Storm in 1991, we were operating 6 super carriers off from Kuwait during Desert Storm. One of the most amazing rollouts. And we did something very similar after 9/11, where we started stacking up aircraft carriers along with their accompanying battleships. But by and large, the most routine deployment today is of the carrier strike group or its amphibious component, the expeditionary strike group, going out there to operate in and around. And that is, quite frankly, the most technologically advanced, combat fleet in the world. And if you don't believe me, just think of what happened, with shooting down all the missiles and the drones and everything in the Red Sea. Now, I'm not generally in favor of using $20 million missiles to shoot down $12,000 drones, but I'm here to tell you if it comes to protecting our allies and partners as well as trying to protect shipping, we're going to do that. I'd also point out that the level of our missile technology today is such that the Iranians popped off, I think, what was over 300 drones and missiles, ranging from everything from the flying Cessna loaded with bomb to 6 ballistic missiles, and not one reached their target. The Israelis just recently launched 30 weapons against a region of Iran, and all 30 reached their targets. So the level of defense and the sophistication of the weapon systems that we see and that we've developed across the span of Captain Hagerott and Captain Gorenflow in my careers is truly astounding. So Morocco doubling down. Choke points, I want to talk just a little bit about today. So choke points, something that Roosevelt focused and concentrated on, that Alfred Thayer Mahan highlighted, whether it was the Malacca Strait or the Strait of Gibraltar or Panama once we created the canal, or Suez once that canal. These choke points are now under assault. And we are already starting to see a fraying of the global international shipping order. The fact that we've lost Red Sea, which is 1/3, it's one node that covers 1/3 of the shipping through the Mediterranean Sea, the Middle Ocean Sea, the middle of the Earth Sea. And when you consider that not only is Suez been impinged upon, but quite frankly, the strait that leads up into the Black Sea has also been impinged upon, which means that Gibraltar becomes the primary node by which Europe is communicating via the sea, as well as its Copenhagen and some of the other ports that go up the eastern coast. The point here is the international system of shipping is beginning to fray. Panama is under pressure right now because of problems with water and shipping through that. We're also starting to see an increase in piracy down in the archipelagic waters of the Pacific. And of course, China is bringing pressure to bear on the South China Sea. So lacking a sufficient size Navy today, because we're only at like 288 ships, I think, as of this morning, we do not have sufficient capacity to protect all the regions of the world that we once did. And so we're starting to see the breakdown of the system that TR helped to create. Port management and control. Who's in control of the ports? China's in control of the ports. So they bought the largest port in Greece. They also helped to manage Panama. They're buying up ports along the western coast of South America. Of course, they control most of the ports across the Asia-Pacific region. He who controls the port controls who can get in and who can get out, and also whether the systems work there. So that's a little problematic for us. and also this declining value of naval presence. We used to be able to send a ship, and if an American ship showed up, then there would be a palpable sense of influence in the region. What we have seen because of the Red Sea is that our ships, or the presence of our ships, is no longer having the coercive diplomatic effect upon the region that they once did. It doesn't matter that there are 3 Arleigh class destroyers sitting in the Red Sea at any given time. Those missiles are still flying. And that is an issue with us in the way that we've applied the power, but it's also an issue in the size of the fleet that we have and our ability to resupply that. Problem with shooting missiles out of 96 vertical launch system tubes is you have to refill those tubes, and that has to happen in port and in a part that has reload capacity. We lack that in many ways today. I think this is bringing it to a close. So again, I'm just going to drumbeat this. The importance of consistent American interests, recognize them, the rise of coercive diplomacy, the ability to use it in a deft and sophisticated way, understanding scalability of response, how you're going to flow ships in and out. Roosevelt demonstrated a genius-like feel, a fingerspitzel, as Kissinger would write, feel of how to work the international system. Seamless spectrum of military power to be able to go from small ships at the low end all the way to the high end. We have gaps in that spectrum of military power today that kind of are problematic with me. One of the areas, for instance, is the ability to do long-range power projection from our carriers. We used to have carrier air wings that could fly 1,000 nautical miles to deliver weapons. Today, our carrier air wings are limited to between 500 to 650 nautical miles. Most of the enemy's missiles can range 900 miles or above. You can never get inside of his swing of his fist to be able to land a counterblow with the air wings we have. That's a gap in the spectrum. And then, of course, understanding the limits of power. I feel sometimes as I watch the way policymakers today that they don't understand the limits of power, and that puts us in a dangerous position sometimes diplomatically. So with that being said, I think that TR still speaks to us today. If we are careful and we read him and we read his notes and we pay attention to the literature and his speeches about things like preparedness, the surest guarantee of peace, etc., he has still things he can tell to us today. But we must be quiet enough to listen to that voice. So that being said, questions? Thank you.
So I'll start with a simple one. Not so simple. Apparently, I can't remember which national security advisor it was to President Trump, but he said that at one point President Trump in the Oval Office picked up I guess a felt tip pen and said, "China is this desk and Taiwan is this tip of my pen." What are we thinking about getting involved in this? Yet we're seeing all this escalating tensions now around Taiwan, the Chinese, the occupation of Hong Kong. Knowing what you know about Roosevelt and his very realistic assessments of power, technology, our interests, right, versus values, right? Because he, of course, allowed the suppression of Philippine insurrections. Our interests were to get control of the Philippines or basically. What do you think he would say about defending Taiwan against a rising power like China?
So if we woke TR up today, reanimated the dead corpse and brought him back and presented him with the world situation and all the investments that he would make, I think he would be incredulous at the degree of what we've signed up for. So the number of alliances that we've made and where we've committed ourselves around the world. That being said, I believe that once he understood how that arrived, and he would be a very quick study, probably reading for 8 or 9 days and come up to speed on most of the things, he would begin trying to figure out how to uphold these commitments. Obviously, when you're dealing with treaty allies, treaties where we've established commitments ratified by the Senate, that cast things in a much different way. Although I think in some ways he would be appalled by the level of our commitments, he would begin to maneuver to try and figure out how to uphold those. Taiwan, I think, becomes a real problematic issue from a Roosevelt realist standpoint. If he's looking at it purely from a diplomatic standpoint, he goes, well, I have no diplomatic commitment to Taiwan. There is no treaty requirement with Taiwan. And in fact, we've had every administration since Carter walking further and further away from Taiwan. However, if Roosevelt, if Mahan walks up to him and whispers in his ear and says, TSMC is making most of the semiconductors in the world, and we need all that to build refrigerators and cars. I think TR is going to step back at that point in time and do economic realism and say, all right, until I can find another supplier of that within this global system that I helped create, I'm going to have to try to maintain stability and use coercive diplomacy to keep China at bay. I think we would see much more activity in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait while we are busily trying to create the CHIPS Act here in the United States. I don't want to sound more and more like a presidential candidate who is no longer running, who talked about that, I'm going to set a deadline for when we're going to leave Taiwan and just, turn it over to them and leave it up to them. But I think that Roosevelt would want to try and gain additional economic resilience here as a means of doing this while he's trying to rebuild the Navy to provide support. The other issue we'd look at, though, is Taiwan, of course, cannot be viewed independently. Geostrategically, Taiwan's security is tied to the Philippines' security, which is a treaty ally, and Japan's security, which is a treaty ally. And so he would want to see how we could interlace those things, and that would take some period of time because we have not integrated the defenses of those geographic countries, those regions sufficiently, and I think that he would start working on that. All right. Yes, sir.
Those of us who know so little about naval history and compared to you, think of the Great White Fleet as this show of power, this announcement of strength. Is there an equivalent in modern times? Is there a big stick that can be waved?
I don't think the problem that you have with the Great White Fleet is it's a trick that can only be done once. Okay. Now, we did try to do something very similar, which I tried to talk him out of when Secretary Mavis sent the Great Green Fleet around the world, flowing a fleet on alternative fuels to demonstrate our commitment to alternative-based, fuels. And that was more of an economic show as well as science and dealing with climate change, et cetera. But so far as the idea of surging a fleet, I think that the nearest things is like our responses to Afghanistan and then to Desert Storm. When, in Desert Storm, we surged 500,000 ground troops and multiple aircraft strike groups into the region. And that's not, there is no speak softly and waving a big stick. That is shouting and waving a big stick at that point in time. And that, in many ways, I think is a problem with many modern practitioners of foreign policy. Everyone wants to talk about speak softly and wave a big stick. Very few people have the sophistication to understand how to do that. How to surge scalability of response, naval forces to a region or other forces to the region, while speaking very carefully, but making sure you understand that if you don't change your way, you're going to get thumped. Roosevelt was able to do that, and again, never had to hit anybody. I think that's the thing that's really remarkable. That's why he has the Nobel Peace Prize, is that sophistication of his foreign policy and his approach to the international arena. Yes, sir.
To turn President Easton's question around,
Inverting the paradigm.
Which you told us how to do so elegantly. What would be the Chinese equivalent of the Great White Fleet? Or has it already happened and we just did not pay attention?
So I think they did it on a smaller scale. If you remember a few years ago, we had a major Pacific exercise, one of our major summertime exercises. And the Chinese came out and did a long row, and I think it was something like 31 surface combatants that came out and sailed on the edge of our exercise. So that was a limited, that was only, quote unquote, in their home waters, where they wanted to demonstrate that in the Western Pacific. But the Chinese are starting to build up in their participation in Task Force 155, the Gulf of Aden counter-piracy operations. They're getting larger and more sophisticated in their approaches to that. Also, they're using small units to bring coercive power against Japan. And what they're doing right now in the South China Sea against the Philippines, I don't think the American people understand how tight things have gotten here in recent weeks over the resupply vessels going out to Scarborough Shoals and the Johnson Atoll and some of the other things that the Philippines are trying to resupply their own military in their own territorial waters as well as their own EEZ. And the Chinese are coming in and really beating them about the head and shoulders with water cannons and so on. And I have written, and I am concerned that we, the United States Navy, will soon have a shouldering event, much like we had in the Black Sea with the Russians in '89. A shouldering event is where a Navy surface combatant from an opposing Navy comes alongside yours, and we go skin to skin, hull to hull, and they push us out of the way. The Chinese have created a new heavy cruiser that just happens to be about 100 feet longer than our largest ship and about 2,000 tons heavier, and also is designed with a very unique flat slab side that would allow them to come alongside something else and without doing significant damage to their ship, but perhaps damage to our ship, come alongside, make contact, and then begin moving out of the way. And I've written that in fact, I'm surprised. I'm overdue, so my prediction is not holding up. I thought that they would do it by the end of last year, based upon the emergence of I think it's the Type 55 cruiser, which is their equivalent of a Ticonderoga class. But they're building, I think they got 14 either in the water or being built right now. By the way, the Chinese are building a new ship, one new surface combatant a month right now. They've gone from one every 6 weeks, they're down to one every 4 weeks right now. They have 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. They have 19 yards, one of which at Jinquan has more capacity than all of our yards combined. And so it's rather sobering. Yes.
I have a question from one of our online viewers. Did T.R.'s Monroe Doctrine say anything about the French and Dutch colonies in South America and the islands of the Caribbean?
Repeat the question.
Oh, so sorry.
No, I can't hear. No, he's over to you.
Sorry, Monroe.
No. So he wanted to know if TR said anything about the French and Dutch colonies that were in Central and South America. Roosevelt effectively believed in live and let live, which was if you're here, you're here. He encouraged counter-revolutionary movements, but he also did not take any active role in trying to toss them out overtly. Covertly, based upon the literature between he and Chauncey Humphreys and the Army officer, I didn't put anything past him on his ability to support insurrections and revolution to try and get Europe out of the Western Hemisphere. But I haven't studied that particular question, so I can't get you an exact answer. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've got a question about the Moroccan crisis, current artist.
Yep.
There. Although we had the Great White Fleet, we were really late to the dance when it came to the naval arms race by that time, with respect to France and Germany. And some of the literature says when it came push to shove, when you're dealing with France and the German interests in that area, that basically Roosevelt backed off in this situation. We still were underprepared in World War I in terms of naval situation. So, I mean, how much truth is there to that, or do you think that's a valid theory?
No, I think it's absolutely true. We were not numero one in the world when Roosevelt left office, but he had set a course for building us to that point in time. And in fact, World War I, again, Josephus Daniels is Secretary of the Navy during World War I, but who's in charge of actually overseeing the fleet buildup in World War I? Franklin D. Roosevelt. Eleanor is Theodore's niece, and Franklin modeled himself entirely upon TR's career path. So Franklin wants to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy, number 2 in the Navy Department, because that's what TR did. And Franklin goes off, becomes governor of New York, because that's what TR did, and then so on. But the point here is, in many ways, Franklin Roosevelt in World War I makes manifest Roosevelt's original building plans. One of the problems with TR's building plan, it was top-heavy. Roosevelt had to make a decision, given the limited amount of money that he had and also the industrial base that he had at that time, on if he only had $1 to spend, what's he spending it on? He spent it primarily on battleships, secondarily on cruisers, and he did not build enough destroyers or, for that matter, submarines. Now, TR was the first president to go down in a submarine, and he understood the importance of the submarine, but he had limited amount of resources, and he spent it all on the top end. Franklin filled out the pyramid. You know, battleships, cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, destroyer escorts. It was all there in Franklin's building program during the First World War.
Back to somewhat towards the Monroe Doctrine. So obviously Roosevelt used the Monroe Doctrine from Quincy, that John Quincy Adams. Are there any other aspects of past presidents that he utilized a lot more, or was everything like up in his head?
So Roosevelt had admiration for really only Abraham Lincoln, and he did harken back. But remember, Roosevelt wasn't satisfied with the Monroe Doctrine. He actually created the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So he felt that everything could be improved upon in the past by him. And so he was not without ego when it came to foreign policy, but he was willing to cite the Monroe Doctrine, even though it had never really been enforced, as justification for all of his actions in the Western Hemisphere, because it would give him historical justifications in the Western Hemisphere. But that being said, he was quick to expand dramatically upon the Monroe Doctrine with the Roosevelt Corollary.
Yeah, I got a question about the Pacific now and coaling stations. So,
Oh, good one. That's a good question.
Roosevelt added coaling stations during his time in terms of the atolls and some of the islands during this period of time, and he recognized that Japan was a rising power in the Pacific, and basically said several times, or was alluded to, have said that we have to be careful with Japan because our next war may be coming with them. So
Oh, he predicted that there would be a war with Japan.
to establish bases in
Yeah.
the Pacific. Yeah.
Yes. And so he really looked at, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was something that he and Mahan had long letters back and forth about coaling stations and overseas bases. Roosevelt had wanted deeper investments in the Philippines.
Right.
And he wanted to pull back out of Hong Kong, where Dewey was very famously based at the beginning of the Spanish-American War. Once we had the Philippines, Roosevelt wanted to make deeper investments there, but he also looked at the other islands across the area. Great White Fleet in many ways was a way of opening conversations with both New Zealand and Australia, because Roosevelt saw that those were going to be important allies in any type of a future conflict with Japan, and he was predicting that there would be an issue with Japan. He had sent his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, over to negotiate some sort of a longstanding peace treaty. He also sent his daughter Alice along, I think mostly to get her out of the White House, because as Roosevelt once very famously said, when someone said you got to get your daughter under control, and he said, well, I can either be Alice's father or president of the United States, but I cannot do both. And so he sent Alice Roosevelt on this as one of his personal representatives to go with Taft to negotiate a security arrangement with the Japanese that did, he thought, put off war by at least another 10 years.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Yet another online message.
I do.
Yep.
Question. So we have aircraft carriers, so 3 now in construction. What other ships are in construction, and then will we get over 300 ships?
So we have all types of ships in construction right now. We have 10 different types of ships under construction right now within the United States Navy. 5 of those programs are on schedule. 5 of those programs are either 1 to 3 years behind schedule because of problems with workforce in the industrial base. So presently we're building aircraft carriers. We are building Arleigh Burke class destroyers. We are building Virginia class submarines, which are fast attack submarine like Captain Gordon drove. We have new Columbia class ballistic missile submarine, which is our strategic deterrent boat, which is coming in around $7.2 billion a copy. Incredible cost for that class, but it has to be super quiet for the next 30 to 50 years. And then we also have the Constellation class frigate that's under construction, and we have supply and logistics ships that are under construction right now. We do not have sufficient industrial base. I'll make this point. If we doubled spending on shipbuilding tomorrow, if we took the shipbuilding budget and we doubled it tomorrow, industry would not build any more ships They are limited in their capacity right now at the established shipyards that we have. They do not have sufficient workforce to meet the orders that they presently have. And so if you're going to actually build the Navy or grow the Navy, you're going to actually have to add shipyards. I was talking with Chancellor Hagerott and Captain Gorenflow earlier tonight about the idea of trying to identify shipyards for some of the smaller unmanned variants along either the Mississippi, Ohio rivers, along the Great Lakes, where we have sufficient blue collar workforce. And I was telling them that we just recently went up to the Missouri, and recognizing that that's navigable waters, if there are shipyards there that we could touch that have workforce standing by, that we should look at some of these new ship classes, small, medium, and large unmanned ships that we could build there and get down to the oceans via our inland waterways. The challenge today is workforce. It's not money. We can spend more money on the Navy. Some people would say, no, you can't. You are $34 trillion in debt. But the challenge today really is, even if I doubled the Navy's budget, I cannot build any more ships any faster because of limits in that workforce. Yes, Marine.
You mentioned the limits of naval power, and that's important for things to recognize that. You also mentioned how TR used the scalpel instead of the hammer.
Yeah.
Shows you how maybe some policy pressures and leaders in the United States have used it in recent history. Your example with the 3 destroyers in the Red Sea kind of comes to mind as I recognize that there's that change. Why did the limits of naval power change? Because when you were talking about TR and what he did specifically with Venezuela, that it seems that there was a foundation behind that. Ships on ships on ships, not all in one particular area, but covering the vast area. Why is there a change? You mentioned the missiles and how we have all of this military technology and advanced weaponry that we can shoot down missiles if an enemy of the United States is launching an attack on either us or one of our allies. But if there's 3 destroyers in the Red Sea, nobody cares. It doesn't deter like it did before.
Well, so I'm going to give a hypothesis. Okay. So I'm going to point out a historical fact. Okay. Of the first 35 presidents of the United States, 12 were general officers of the United States Army. Okay. Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, William Henry Harrison, Andrew Jackson, all the way up through Dwight D. 5-star Eisenhower. Okay. Generals of the Army. No naval officer had ever served as president of the United States up until that point. Then we hit on a streak of 6 out of 7 presidents of the United States were naval officers whose formative foreign policy years were created by their service in World War II. Starting with John Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, although very limited amount of time, he did go overseas and served in the Navy. You go into Richard Nixon, you go to Gerald R. Ford, you go to Jimmy Carter, the only Naval Academy graduate to ever be elected president of the United States. Then we skip Reagan, who is an Army guy, Army Cavalry, National Guard, and then we get to George H.W. Bush, perhaps our most distinguished in the sense of sailor statesman in his encapsulation of foreign policy. And then after Bush, we enter a period of time where none of the people actually did have a military background, either active service or any. I believe that if you look at American foreign policy up through those first 35 presidents, with the exception of the 2 Roosevelts, Franklin and Theodore, it was almost a continentalist ground power foreign policy. They viewed the world as continental in sense of, we're here on the North American continent. What can I do from here? With the exception of the 2 Roosevelts and then the 6 naval officers, now we have a global internationalist view who have an appreciation of naval power, its subtlety, its nuance. And you actually see in the case of many of these sort of this nuanced application. Since then, we have been led by leaders who don't have a military background, aren't even deeply schooled in it. And I don't mean this is a bipartisan failure. So this is not a partisan hit. We don't have people that have a sense of military history, military strategy. It's not part of their upbringing or their backgrounds to be able to have that deftness of, I don't even know if if many of them have read like the books about Theodore Roosevelt, if they read Edmund's books on, Theodore Rex, that's a great primer. That is a great primer on foreign policy, let alone getting into all those other books I put up there, that you would have that. But a lot of these guys, young men who went to sea as sailors on board ships, and they saw the Navy in action, and so it became instinctive in their minds. I haven't written this essay. I've been thinking about writing this essay for publishing about the navalist presidents, that how much their viewpoints on foreign policy later were formed by their early experience, even as junior officers in the Navy, because they saw that fleet in action. Another question?
Is Mexico committed to building its own canal to the west of the Yucatan?
I do not know. Do not know. Have not come across that in the literature. I know that there was, long-standing interest in a canal through Nicaragua, but once Panama built its canal, essentially all other conversations, as far as I know, went away. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to come here to Dickinson. All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight.
Thank
I am hearing reports that there's some thunderstorms going on outside, so be safe going home. So thank you again, Dr. Hendrix. Thank you. Thank you.